Hey class, this is a lecture video for the stuff for April 14th with regard to human rights instruments and the protection agenda. So, what we're going to start with is Leatherman's book, and I want to focus particularly on, the Security Council and the protection problem and some Security Council resolutions that became very important. Now, not all these are in Leatherman's book because some of them are more recent, so this is why I included this other link, a couple links on our folder for today. One is a listing of some very important Security Council resolutions that address sexualized violence and conflict, and then one that was very recent, which we'll talk about in more detail later. So, important to understand, like the ad hoc tribunals that we studied for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, and also the 1988 Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court. We talked about the Rome Statute elements of crimes way back in the beginning of the semester. So those things laid the groundwork for the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000. This specifically addressed violence against women, including in conflict. And if you go to the link on Blackboard that says UN Women List of Security Council Resolutions on Sexualized Violence and Conflict, you'll see you can click on the link for Resolution 1325. This became very important. And on page 167 into 168 in Leatherman's book, I wanted to read a little quote that was very important, that it recognized for the first time the role of women in conflict. This is Resolution 1325, not only as victims, but as actors in the prevention and resolution of conflict and equal participation in peace building and decision making. So not just about like what happens to them during conflict, being victimized by sexualized violence and other forms of violence, but also post-conflict capacity building and rebuilding of the country and stuff like that. It calls for the full implementation of international humanitarian and human rights law during and after conflicts to protect women and children, and calls on conflict parties to protect women and girls from gender-based violence, especially rape and other forms of sexual abuse. It also calls on states to put an end to impunity and prosecute those responsible for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. It also sets new standards to overcome the gendered aspects of conflict during its intensification, escalation, and de-escalation phases, and in the context of peacekeeping and reconstruction of society. So it really set out a really awesome broad agenda with regard to how women in particular are affected by conflict, and sets the stage post-conflict to include them in peace building and rebuilding of society operations, right? There were some drawbacks with this. The text itself kind of tends to infantilize women, lumping them into a category that Cynthia Enloe, a feminist scholar, talks about: women and children, all as like one word. It limits our understanding of women's relational autonomy and agency, as well as their many roles in conflict, including being perpetrators, perhaps. So it also leaves out male non-combatants and their role in being victimized or being victims during conflict as well, particularly with sexualized violence. So it leaves out all that stuff. But besides that, it really was very important to set the groundwork for including women as being important with regard to their roles in conflict, their roles in peace building after conflict, etc. So very super important. So after what this laid the groundwork for us, Security Council Resolution 1325 and other resolutions we'll discuss in a minute, it really set up the an intricate development of programming through the UN and other partnerships or partnership organizations to specifically aid women and girls in conflict and in post-conflict situations. One of the shortfalls of this, and we discussed this before, was the failure of DDR programs to address the needs of former female combatants, and Leatherman talks about this here as well. It doesn't really address their needs because of our uninterrogated gender assumptions regarding women and girls being hapless victims in conflict. Particularly, it does not fail to recognize the role that women and girls sometimes play as perpetrators of violence, as being soldiers. So it's important to understand how women can have multiple identities during conflict, not just victims, right? So it does fail to include them in the DDR process and kind of essentialize women's roles as a victim, right? But anyway, 1325 nonetheless was very important in addressing the impact of conflict on women and how important it is to understand. So there's another thing that the international community, kind of a norm that started to emerge around in 2005, right? It was introduced at the World Summit at UN headquarters. And it was a follow-up to another summit that happened in 2000 called the Millennium Summit. And it's the Responsibility to Protect Doctrine. And I want you to click on this link on Blackboard that is entitled Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, what is R2P. And this became a very important aspirational goal. What it really holds is that when we think about the important functions of the state, we think about to protect citizens, its own citizens. However, when the state is unwilling or unable to protect its civilians, or is the main perpetrator of violence against civilians, the international community has a duty to intervene, a responsibility to protect, right? And this goes against some international political norms such as state sovereignty, right? So it kind of comes into conflict with that. So it really talks about how it's important for the international community to intervene in situations of genocide, mass atrocities, and conflict, particularly perpetrated by the state, or wherein other forces are perpetrating these things and the state is unwilling or unable to protect its own civilians from these things. So read this document, the 3 pillars of responsibility that it talks about, and some other things in there, some other links that are associated with that I encourage you to read as well. So that became a very important norm. The next Security Council resolution that Leatherman talks about was a very monumental one as well. It was Security Council Resolution 1820, which was adopted in 2008. It built on 1325, the Rome Statute, the World Summit in 2005, the Convention on the Rights of a Child, and other things. And it became a very important resolution that called for much, and I wanted to read an excerpt from Leatherman as a summary of what it entailed. Resolution 1820 notes that, this is page 171, rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute a war crime, a crime against humanity, or a constitutive act with respect to genocide, meaning the act of rape itself can constitute genocide, a genocidal action. Stresses the need for the exclusion of sexual violence crimes from amnesty provisions in the context of conflict resolution processes, and calls upon member states to comply with their obligations for prosecuting persons responsible for such acts. It calls on member states to ensure equal protection under the law and equal access to justice for all victims of sexual violence, particularly women and girls. So this was a very important measure, a very important resolution that was adopted. It is important to note at this time that there was also a conference that was held kind of contemporaneously with the passage or the adoption of this resolution, and it was a working group that, the book does not talk about this, but it was a working group that involved some civil society actors, scholars, practitioners in conflict and post-conflict situations that talked about some gaps in the international protection agenda. One was with regard to the importance of including men as victims of sexualized violence and conflict. 1820 does not talk about that. It talks about particularly women and girls, and then like the language throughout the resolution talks about how it becomes more exclusory towards how we need to protect just women and girls. There's in our additional content folder, there is an article from Sanders Shivakumaran, who we had an article from him before when we talked about men as victims of sexualized violence and conflict. A different article he wrote in 2010 talks about the exclusory language in this resolution that neglects to take into account that men and boys can also be victims of sexualized violence and conflict. So one drawback with that. However, it was important overall because it called for measures to improve UN peacekeeping operations, capacity to protect civilians, and prevent conflict-related sexualized violence as well. So the UN began implementing this strategy by coordinating with the UN system and other agencies and NGOs and forging partnerships with them. So very good stuff. Now, this stuff is not in the book. If you go back to the UN Women link with regard to Security Council resolutions, you'll see a couple more. You're going to see Security Council Resolution 1888 and Security Council Resolution 1889, both adopted in 2009. The 1888 was important because it requested that the UN Secretary General appoint a special representative, a special rapporteur, to provide leadership, and created a commission with regard to sexualized violence and conflict. And this became so important. So basically, there was going to be like one representative and one group of people in the UN specifically dedicated to focusing on sexualized violence and conflict, which was so monumental. 1889 also called for the strengthening, the monitoring and implementing of 1325, ensuring gender mainstreaming and post-conflict peace building and recovery processes and sectors, basically including women's voices in the process with regard to what is important on the ground in order to focus on sexualized violence and in the post-conflict arena as well. In 2010, Security Council Resolution 1960 was adopted. This was a Security Council resolution that called for accountability system for perpetrators of conflict-related sexualized violence. You can read more about that by clicking on the resolution particularly. Another resolution that was important was 2106, which was adopted in 2013, and basically reiterated that all actors, United Nations Security Council, parties to the armed conflict, member states, UN entities, must do more to implement actions that were embodied in previous mandates in order to combat impunity for crimes of sexualized violence and conflict related. So that was very important. One particular Security Council resolution that was adopted just last year was Security Council Resolution, let me get back to my notes, 2467. That was adopted last year in April of 2019. This called for a much more survivor-centered approach to gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexualized violence. If you go to our folder, you will see a link that's by IPI Global Observatory, which is entitled, "What Does April Security Council Resolution on Sexual Violence and Conflict Mean for Women and Girls?" This is written by Vanessa Jackson. This is a really important analysis of this resolution, 2467. And it talks about using a survivor-centered approach with regard to when a woman or a girl is raped or any survivor of sexualized violence. It is important to talk about how their human rights have been violated and that they're entitled to redress and remedy, right? This is a really important link to read with regard to having this resolution. There's some drawbacks that she does critique with regard to the resolution, with regard to the member states involved, some of which, such as Russia, the Russian Federation, which haven't been the best with regard to this, as well as China, and propping up regimes that consistently violate women's rights in conflict and post-conflict situations. I am going to end this video because we're almost at the end of the 15 minutes, and we'll move on to our next video. So go to the next video. Thank you.